So what we're going to do, we're going to try to have a kind of an informal discussion here about the different issues that arise based on this fact pattern, which can be pretty interesting. And I think we're all going to try to relate it to some real life cases we've actually handled that are a little goofy, and as they often are, and just chat about that a little bit. We've got a small group, so feel free to pipe in. Let us know if you want to say anything, or you can correct me if I'm wrong on something, which I'm almost certain to happen. So anything like that. But I'm Mike McGrory. I'm an attorney in Chicago at Smith Amundsen. I've been doing aviation law for about 12 years. Before that, I was a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. Go ahead, Carrie.
Hi, I'm Carrie Ryan. I'm with now AXA XL. I've been with them for about 14 years handling aviation claims.
Good morning. Thanks for everybody for joining us so early today. My name is Don Makalinsky. I'm with Trustler. I'm also practicing in Cook County for about 30 years, primarily in aviation and premises liability.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out so early. My name is Stephen Fisher. I am currently a claims analyst with Allianz. I handle passenger claims for major airlines. I've only been doing that about 6 months. Before that, I was a defense attorney for a boutique aviation law firm called Martinez and Retorto in New York City. And I handled basically the gamut of aviation issues, from airline, general aviation products, airport premises issues. So, yeah.
So I think the first issue that I kind of spotted in watching the video and reading the fact pattern, I'm sure everybody read the fact pattern very closely, is the sort of the shift from day to night. So that plane's been sitting there for a long time, right? I think the fact pattern reflects it's just over 3 hours, which I know then sort of invokes some Department of Transportation rules about what the crew has to do, and also tends to provoke some lawsuits from some dissatisfied passengers. Carrie, do you have any experience with those kinds of cases?
We've had a few on some on a couple of cases. Generally, they haven't amounted to much. They haven't been quite as drastic as these. But I think as everyone carries a phone and video and media is so prevalent, passengers are becoming more apt to file a claim over any small thing or large thing. But part of the problem is the airlines have to, everybody has to remember, everybody's carrying a phone and a video in their pocket. People are very intolerant of anything that goes wrong, that they feel they're being punished or unduly treated. And it becomes a problem because they put it on social media, and then it becomes a PR issue for the airline. And that's where our, bigger issues are, is how to handle the PR aspects. A lot of the claims at the end of the day don't amount to anything, but it's the PR aspect that becomes a bigger issue for our client.
And that dovetails too into the defense of the case. When you're assigned the defense of the airlines, your immediate thinking, how best to defend this claim. But you also have to be cognizant of the PR perspective from the airlines, because ultimately that's your client. So I'll give you an example of that. Even though not necessarily in this scenario, you may have a fellow passenger that is a tortfeasor or approximate cause of the accident. For instance, an overhead bin incident where they're the ones that are dropping the luggage. Now, normally if you have who the tortfeasor is, you can bring them in as a counterclaim, but you really have to make sure that your client, the airline, is comfortable with bringing in a fellow passenger into the lawsuit, or you have a situation where a mother is involved with the care of the child. And 99% of the time, the airline is not going to want you to file that contribution claim against the other passenger or the mother. So you have to, integrate, make sure you have a team approach with the insurer or the insured, and defense counsel have a strategy.
To piggyback on that, airlines never want to disclose the names of passengers, let alone file contribution actions against passengers. So they'll do anything and everything to avoid disclosing names of passengers and filing lawsuits. That's certainly nothing that the airline wants any part of. As far as delays, obviously you have to be cognizant of whether they're an international flight and or international passengers on connecting flights, because there's obviously different standards involved, whether it's an EU 261 issue, whether it's a Montreal Convention issue. and or the DOT regulations. There's obviously different standards involved for all those things. And also you got to look at your airline's contract of carriage, what the indemnity, what the limitations of liability are in there, what are the passenger obligations, how do they say, if it's a weather issue, if it's an ATC issue, they're pretty much going to take their hands out of the situation. And also international flights, Montreal Convention, they have basically like an all reasonable measures defense where an airline will try to invoke that if it's a weather or ATC related issue. So got to be cognizant of that. But as far as war stories, I mean, passengers try to basically invoke anything and everything relating to a delayed flight. They'll argue that, my destination, I was having, surgery. I missed my surgery appointment. I'm gonna have, damages out the wazoo. I had medication in my baggage. I didn't get my baggage in time. We see anything and everything. And if it truly is a weather or ATC related issue, you really have a very strong defense. You want to obviously be cognizant, and the passengers are our customers, so we try to help them out to the best we can. But if they're invoking, hundreds of thousands of dollars because of missed surgeries and missed medications, you really have to invoke those defenses.
Yeah, I've had a couple of these cases, a number of these cases, but a couple kind of stand out in my memory. One was a pretty wealthy and prominent Chicago attorney who his flight was delayed. He got held over in Newark coming back from Europe to Chicago, and the airline put him up in a hotel in Newark, and it was, I'll always remember his complaint says the hotel was disgusting and dirty and awful, and there were hookers all over the lobby. Now, at least some people pay extra for that, so maybe you shouldn't complain about that. But usually these cases are pro se, or else you just have kind of a small single shop attorney handling them. And this guy's a prominent lawyer, so he had his minion associates working this case up, night and day went on for over a year, which was just silly for a delay case. The other one is a serial litigant, and it wouldn't surprise me if some people in this room have had cases against him. I think he sues every time he gets off of an airplane. He got held over in Cancun, I think it was, and his complaint had the itemized list of expenses he wanted to recover from the airline. And I'll never forget, he managed to spend $60 on a pair of underwear, and that was in the complaint as well. And so he wanted $8,000, and to our client's credit, they said, no, we're not, try it. So we tried it, we had a bench trial and tried it, and the judge awarded him $800, and that was it. And I'm sure we spent a lot more in defending that than, selling with $8,000 was. But sometimes especially a guy like that who just sues literally every time he gets off an airplane, I think you gotta sort of come up and take a stand.
There are a number of those. We had one in Canada. It was a couple, and because Air Canada, you have to do both French and English, and any time they failed to do that, a steward, failed to speak in both languages or whatever, they would file a suit.
Really?
Yeah, and they did the same thing. It's like these people are going to be perpetual pains in the neck unless you take them to court, and it's going to cost the airline money, but there comes a point where you have to do it.
And that raises a good point, Carrie. Do you ever have discussions with your client, the airline, as to whether or not they should, cease the business relationship with these people just, because they keep filing these frivolous claims?
Yeah, absolutely. And even just the expense of going through trial. You do it when you really need to do it, and we try to balance cost of defense versus a settlement cost, but sometimes, like you pay such a small amount, you offered such a small amount, it's like, do we really want to spend $50, $100, whatever, $1,000 on trying a stupid, silly little case? But you don't have a choice. At some point, the client has to put their foot down and say, enough's enough already.
And there is, with this particular plaintiff, the one with the $60 underwear, we talked to our client about blacklisting him, basically. So don't sell him tickets anymore. And they were not interested in that. Have you had any luck with that, or any sort of discussions like that? Or has anyone done that?
I haven't seen anyone actually do it.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion, but they're fearful because, again, that happens, and then that person's going to go to social media and say, this airline's not allowing me to fly. And again, it becomes a PR issue. And I think it's I think a big issue today is that just everyone's so willing to just put everything out there in the public that, clients are afraid. They don't want the bad PR. They have to weigh those issues. Is it worth it or not?
Are you seeing a lot of delay claims?
We have not seen a lot, no.
What about you, Stephen?
I'm getting a lot. A lot of them have to do with weather and ATC related issues, so we really don't have a ton of liability with those claims, but we will try to accommodate the passenger to some extent. I don't want to call it nuisance value, but a lot of the times it just doesn't pay for us to deny the claim outright and have them potentially file a lawsuit. So we'll give them nominal damages through either vouchers or miles or a nominal cash settlement if we need to. We prefer doing vouchers and miles, but yeah.
Hi, can I ask a question? It's only because you spoke about airlines' reluctance to sort of take things on if there's going to be a PR issue. Now, this is a real life example. It happened to my wife, where she was in charge crew member on a flight to, I think it was to Stockholm or something, and sitting in business class was a guy called Dizzy Rascal. I don't know if you know Dizzy Rascal. He's an English rap star, English yoga really. When the flight was delayed, he then proceeded to start abusing my wife, and it sort of escalated to where my wife had to lock herself in the flight deck. Dizzy Rascal was then ejected from the aeroplane. My wife she came straight home, was very, very upset, and the airline basically almost backed Dizzy Rascal because the PI got in the Daily Mail, which is a notorious paper, against airlines in the UK. And BA decided then that, my view as I'd actually retired from BA by then, was that he should be banned from flying on any airline. But BA backed down on that, and I was slightly disappointed about it. I don't know if that was the BA legal department suggesting that, or the PR department, or what. I just wonder if these type of issues ever get to the stage where...
That's fine. I suspect if he wasn't a prominent person, he'd have been kicked off and that'd be that, right? But yeah, you have to worry about the publicity. So I kind of see their point, but I'd rather see them go to bat for their employees regardless of the passengers. I don't know.
Yeah, I find that airlines are deathly afraid of social media these days, and it seems to be the quickest way for a passenger claim to come to us is by broadcasting on social media. I find that when passengers go through the proper channels of filing complaints either through email or the phone or the hotline or whatever, it kind of takes a while for the airline to get around to them. But when they broadcast things on social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, whatever else, I mean, they have dedicated social media people, like teams, going, just monitoring the social media atmosphere, and they'll respond to these people right off the bat, and they seem to get to us really quickly. So I think airlines are extremely sensitive to social media, and probably rightly so with the way things go these days.
Now, in a case like in the fact pattern we have, I don't think the heir apparent, I don't think they really had any choice. They were kind of stuck on that runway and had to stay on that runway. Does that make a difference in these types of claims?
Absolutely. In the contract of carriage, it says that we're not responsible for delays due to basically things that are out of their hands, such as weather, ATC grounding issues, those kinds of things. So it's absolutely a huge difference. I mean, we'll still try to accommodate the passenger to the best that we can, but as far as extremely difficult and large claims, if they are alleging medical issues, if they're alleging, they didn't get to their doctors in time or their surgeries in time and those kinds of things, we really just, we can't accommodate those things.
And so I guess that sort of leads us then into a little bit of what Steve had mentioned, which is the passengers behaving badly aspect of this case. And it sounds like that things were just bananas on that airplane. And, in a way you can kind of see how that could happen if you're trapped in an airplane and you don't know what's going on for a few hours. But we've got that fact pattern. I think it says there's $40,000 worth of damage to the heir apparent plane. Of course, you have that guy who opened the door and tumbled out. So I don't know. And in my experience, what happens when these passengers behave badly, they often blame someone else, anyone else around you, and you get a lot of sort of fabricated stories about what happened. what's your experience, Carrie, with sort of the passengers misbehaving?
It usually is because they're drunk. I mean, I know that comes as a shock to everyone here. You know, and it's hard, the hardest thing we've had to sort of figure out is, were they drunk as they boarded the plane because either the flight was delayed or they got to the airport early and they were, you know, drinking at one of the restaurants or in, you know, the airline's club, whatever. Or were they overserved on the plane itself? And I don't know about you, Stefan, but, you know, one of the things we've talked about internally and with some of our clients is, you know, how do you know if someone's overserved, and where do you draw the line? And is it the steward's responsibility to draw the line? You know, was there something to be said about, you know, maybe making a drink maximum, you know, on a, you know, based on the time or length of the flight, duration of the flight? Because most of them are, and, you know, my feeling is you consciously drank that, so, you know, whatever you did, you're an idiot and you're responsible. But unfortunately, stupidity and idiocy aren't exclusions or defenses to a claim. So it's been a struggle, and, you know, thankfully the ones we have haven't amounted to much once we've sort of delved into receipts and things like that. You know, we've had a couple out of our London office on the economy airlines where they do a lot of group packaging for holiday weekend trips, you know, and the guys or the girls go out for a, you know, a weekend for a bachelor party or whatever, and that tends to be the most difficult situation. And, you know, they've got 3 friends or 4 friends with them who are all defending him, you know, and usually we've been able to find a witness or 2, so thankfully hasn't amounted to much.
You know, and on the delay situation, so before you even get to board the aircraft, you know, they're drinking in the terminal before they even board the airplane. So, you know, even though you may only serve them 1 drink inside the aircraft itself, you don't know the fact that they've been drinking out in the terminal for 6 hours. You know, and what I think is one of the defenses is to get the pilot involved if they remove a passenger based on security issues. And I think that's a good defense. And I think when you try these cases in front of a jury, the jury will be able to appreciate it, that the pilot is the pilot in command and has ultimate authority who he's going to fly. So, you know, if the pilot makes a good witness and say, based on all known available information, passenger X was intoxicated and he was a potential security risk for the passengers, I don't want to fly him, and you remove him from the aircraft before it departs, I think that's a good defense.
Absolutely, yeah. The federal regulations actually help the airlines greatly with that. So it's actually almost easier if the passenger is inebriated before boarding the plane, because, like Don said, you know, the federal regulations allow the captain to make the call based on his objective observation, actually subjective observations, that if he feels that the passenger is inebriated and could be a safety hazard to the operation of the flight, it's within his complete subjective opinion to prevent him from boarding the plane. And the federal regulations actually give the airline a pretty good safeguard for that, and I've litigated those claims, and it's pretty good, and you can argue federal preemption in lawsuits based on that standard, so it gives the airline some good backing on that. It's a little different when the passenger already is on the plane and drinking. That makes things a lot more difficult, and that's why airlines should have the most leeway in preventing these passengers from boarding in the first place, because once you get up in the air, there's very little that you can do. We don't want to hog-tie passengers and
Right.
and that kind of thing. So and that leads to the social media aspect that airlines are so keen to prevent. So that's a huge thing that airlines are really allowed to do, that getting these passengers and preventing them from boarding in the beginning. Piggybacking on some of Kerry's drinking observations on planes, I have a pretty good war story for an unruly passenger that I can share with you guys. It actually was litigated and went to dismissal, so I can talk about it. A passenger went to meet his online bride in Ukraine, and got to the Ukraine, but his Ukrainian flight, his airline actually got defunct while he was there. So he got rerouted on Delta through Tel Aviv. On his flight from Tel Aviv to New York, he claims that he was nervous for the flight, so he chain smoked 3 packs in like the 3 hours before the flight. So that's like 90 cigarettes. Yeah, exactly. So he gets on the plane. The plane flies up. He goes to use the lavatory. He gets out of the lavatory, and smoke billows out of the lavatory. Flight attendant observes this. Flight attendant goes up to the passenger and gives him one of those, kind of warning cards, and says, we observed you smoking in the lavatory. And the guy says, "What? No, you're crazy. I never did that." And he throws the card back at the flight attendant. Things escalate a little bit. They yell back and forth. The flight attendant goes and tells the lead flight attendant. The lead flight attendant comes back. More escalation. And now the passenger's getting really unruly. He starts screaming epithets at the flight attendants, saying that they're going to all lose their jobs. He's going to sue everybody, blah, blah, blah. Now he's starting to get angry that the passengers aren't protecting him. So now this is a flight from Israel, meanwhile. So now he's starting to scream racial epithets, religious sensitive remarks to the fellow passengers. Invoking the Holocaust, why aren't you guys helping me? I'm a fellow, Jewish person, all this kind of stuff. Finally, the flight attendants notify the flight deck, the captain, one of the captains, I'm not sure, there were 5 pilots on this flight because it's a, 10-hour flight. So one of the pilots comes back, tries to calm them down. He puts his hand on the passenger's shoulder. Now the passenger screams, "Assault, assault," that kind of thing. So finally, the marshals are alerted. The flight deck is on lockdown. Flight finally lands. Marshals escort the gentleman off the plane. As he's getting off the plane, he kind of knocks his leg into one of the seat bottoms and claims he has a sprained ankle, sprained knee. So now he can invoke the Montreal Convention because he has an injury. So we get the lawsuit. He hires, some fly-by-night, local attorney, no aviation experience. He files a $100 million lawsuit against the airline.
You cut the check.
Yeah, invoking anything and everything but the Montreal Convention because he's not an aviation attorney. He argues, anything under the sun from assault, false arrest, negligent infliction of emotional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Anything and everything, punitive damages, out the wazoo. So I get this claim, and I'm like, there's something off here. So I do a little research. This guy has the most ridiculous bio. He was indicted for attempted murder of his wife. He had sued anyone and everyone from the police departments for false. I can't even go into anything and everything. And half the time he had the same attorney doing all these lawsuits. So we do the lawsuit, we do the litigation, we do the discovery. It turns out this guy actually recorded the entire thing on his phone. Audio recording, not a visual recording. And this was the best evidence that we could possibly have because you could hear this guy screaming, carrying on, raising his voice, cursing at everybody, talking about the religious, things. So we did the deposition. I had him authenticate, the recording, all this stuff, and we did this deposition off-site because I didn't want this guy anywhere near my office. But turns out we were able to we did a motion to dismiss. He didn't even argue the Montreal Convention in the beginning, so I actually had to make the arguments for him that, this is a Montreal Convention case, and I tried to come up with, the quote-unquote accidents that he could have had. He tried to amend the complaint with these new accidents, and initially it was referred to the magistrate, and who unfortunately only dismissed some of the actions. But then I appealed to the district judge, and I actually attached the CD to the motion so that the judge can really hear the modulations and the screaming and carrying on. And once the judge heard that, he compared it to his deposition testimony, and he said, no, look, this makes no sense. What this guy is arguing in the litigation just doesn't fly with what would actually happen on the plane. And he threw the whole thing out, and we were able to get out, on summary judgment. So, really think outside the box with these things. Don't just go by, the paper documents. You really gotta, anything and everything that you can put in front of a judge on these kinds of things, especially with these kinds of passengers. You really gotta put everything and everything together.
And then what happened with
Yeah,
his
then
lawyers?
what happened?
I'm sorry? Oh, and so it never got appealed, and it turned out the reason why it didn't get appealed is because the plaintiff's attorney was indicted himself and fled the country for embezzling funds from his clients. So it turned out a couple years later he came back to the country to visit his mother or something like that. He got arrested out at the airport and I think is currently serving a prison sentence. So definitely a war story for the ages, for sure.
But I'm sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, just to piggyback on what you're saying in terms of the evidence, if you're fortunate enough to find out about an incident that occurs out at an airport, it's ideal if you're the defense attorney to get out there as soon as possible so you can look at the area, because there's a lot of cameras out there. So if you can actually find out where the location of the fall is, you can find out where the cameras are. And oftentimes there's multiple parties that have cameras, whether it's the airport itself or the airline, and possibly even some of the vendors inside the airport. And the problem with these cameras is that they lose the tape, or the tape gets overwritten relatively quickly after an incident. So if you can get out to the scene, ideally that same day, particularly on a catastrophic incident, you can identify the cameras, identify who the owner of the cameras are, and send out notice that they should preserve that evidence, because, as you point out, a lot of the visual evidence is really the key to your case. And what you don't want to do is 2 years later try to find all this evidence, because I can guarantee it's not going to be available.
Yeah, usually 30 to 60 days.
they tape over
The airlines
those,
tape
yeah.
over those things.
So these cases they all come in kind of similarly. You get a complaint, and you can practically see the plaintiff with a halo over their heads, how wonderful they were and they didn't do anything wrong. And these rotten airline people kicked me off the plane, and these rotten airport police officers arrested me, and all that stuff. And you always think, well, okay, now for the rest of the story, and you call your client and find out what happened. And we had a woman who, she was near 60, got arrested on a flight. I think she was coming from Germany, got arrested at O'Hare for misbehaving on the airplane. I don't remember what the exact charges were. And so she sued and said, I didn't do a thing. This is outrageous. And so we talked to the police officer who arrested her and said, I arrested her for the FBI. The FBI took over this case and interviewed her, and they did whatever they did with her. I don't think the cop even knew what happened. And so we got the FBI records, which was kind of a hassle to even get those, but they were hysterical when we got them. It turns out this woman got completely hammered on the airplane, and there was a younger man, 21, 22 years old, sitting next to her, and they really, really hit it off. So they had this burgeoning May-December relationship going on, aisle 15 or whatever it was, and drinking the whole way from Europe and making everybody around them very, very uncomfortable. The flight attendants cut them off, and the woman actually crawled down the aisle of the airplane to the flight attendant cart to steal those little bottles of, airplane liquor they had. So she grabbed a bunch of those and brought them back to her new boyfriend, and just outrageous. And the FBI, they had a big stack of investigatory materials on this. They interviewed all the passengers and everything. And so we got that, and we turned it over in discovery, and the case was gone within, a week, because I think the plaintiff's lawyer realized that they had a bit of a liar on their hands. But we get these cases all the time. Don and I were handling one recently, another, it's hard, a lot to go into, and it's still ongoing, so I won't get into too much, but it's a fight on the jet bridge, and a passenger attacked one of the airline employees in a real tight, confined space on the jet bridge, and called the police, and
Lesson, don't swing at a Chicago cop.
yeah, they swing back, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's going on still, for my clients going on. Don got out early. But there's a lot of these cases, and it's just people acting like idiots. And for the life of me, cannot figure out how to get more than one beer on a flight anywhere, and these people are getting drunk and having a good time and causing lots of trouble.
So just picking up on the fact pattern, as you saw, I think Rick pointed out that there's how many potential tortfeasors, responsible parties?
Right now, it's just we're looking at the airline and we're looking at the passengers' comparative fault.
All right, well, you have to look at the provisioning truck because everybody saw that huge gap between the truck and the airplane. So I've had a couple of those cases. So, there's rules and procedures for these provisioning trucks. And, that brings up an interesting point. Anytime you have an airport claim involving a vendor, there's typically contracts involving the vendor has to name the airline as an additional insured under their policy, which sounds perfect because, when the contract is originally made, they have all these obligations to procure this insurance. But what happens, as I've seen time and again, is that these vendors, usually because they're low bidder, guess what? They never go out and buy the insurance, or they'll let the insurance lapse after the first year of the contract. So, that's one of the first things I would take a look at this case is, number one, is that provisioning truck, is the airline as an additional insured? Did it meet its obligations in terms of pulling up to the airplane?
And I was wondering if he was disembarking for purposes of the Montreal Convention, if that was it's a weird claim, though. I know you and I sort of had one where my client tendered it to your client and you accepted it and took it, but it was someone who was a cleaning crew member cleaning the airplane, and I don't know which door they fell out, but just fell out of the door, right? And injured pretty badly, right?
Yeah, I mean, she was catastrophic. I mean, it was she fell on her head, from the height of the door. And unfortunately, for my client, the vendor didn't have the appropriate coverage and didn't name the airline as additional insured. So I don't even know if they had the comp to protect this young lady that was badly hurt. So, and then we get into these business considerations that we talked about a little bit earlier. From my perspective, I wanted to, I don't know how the client could continue to do business because this was the second claim where they didn't have the appropriate insurance. And I think ultimately they did sever that business relationship. But you have to keep in mind that the business folks that are running the airline, they love this vendor because they get such a low price on their product. So, there's a real push and pull between the business folks and the risk management, particularly because the business folks are like, well, that's why we bought insurance, to protect us. So even though our vendor, where we're getting this great deal from, breaches the contract, they don't want to, terminate that contract. I mean, I don't know what your experience
Yeah,
on
no,
those.
because the cost to the bottom line of the company across all the airports, wherever they use that same vendor, it's going to be a lot more than the risk of paying out that claim.
Yes, Rick?
I was just going to add to that I know of no airline, and I certainly don't know all of them, that has anybody that keeps track of their insurance, their certificates of insurance, when they expire, and make sure that everybody
And checks
they
they're
deal with
legitimate.
has a current certificate and a
Right.
current policy. And it would be a hell of a spreadsheet, but all it would take is one claim saved for that person's salary to be fully paid with benefits.
Absolutely.
And I would encourage anybody on the airline side that if they don't have somebody tasked with that, it would be a very worthwhile component of their risk management.
Now, for this gentleman who fell out, what are his claims? Who's he going to sue? Any ideas?
He's going to sue the airline. He's probably going to sue the plane manufacturer. I'm sure there's something he can come up with. Oh, I shouldn't have been able to open the door. It's your fault. You made the story easy for
Later, just so everybody knows. We've got a few little tricks up our sleeve.
But he died, so we don't have any story on what he was thinking or what he was trying to do, right? We
I'm
just
sure his
know he had-
family knows exactly what
yeah,
he was
sure.
thinking.
He was probably narrating as it
Yep.
happened. But
He audio recorded it on his phone.
now, have you had falls from airplanes?
We have, but it's been maintenance workers. It hasn't been, when they've been working on the plane and someone on the ground says, moves the air stair and they don't bother to look as they're.
I had a case in which, and I only looked at the coverage, and it occurred out of the country. This is many years ago, in which a blind gentleman was pre-boarded after his son insisted that he get on board a plane earlier. Someone with dubious authority took him to the ramp up an air stair on an airplane with one flight attendant on it at the time, and both doors of the aircraft were open with nothing on the other side. And there you fill in the blanks, but it ended. Any claim was brought by his estate. Leave it there, but that's the closest to this I've seen.
Yeah.
You know, I've had at least 2 falls from aircraft, one involving a minor that went out the back door during provisioning. So what was nice about that, because you know the discussion yesterday was prevention, and in that particular case, it wasn't necessarily motivated by the plaintiff or plaintiff's attorney, but there was a change in the policy in terms of announcements for this particular airline to prevent future falls. So I thought that was a good outcome from this particular case.
I have a current claim where a drunk passenger fell out of, it was a small airplane, a regional carrier, and it didn't really fit perfectly with the jet bridge, so they used an adapter. It's kind of like a little metal walkway, and because they have to use the metal walkway, it kind of leaves gaps along the walkway between the jet bridge and the plane. So an inebriated passenger got off the plane, traversed the little adapter, stumbled, and actually stumbled backwards down the gap and onto the tarmac about 8 feet below, and fractured his spine. And this kind of actually dovetails into our prior discussion. He didn't drink on the plane, but he had drunk at least 3 drinks in the plane, in the terminal prior to departure. And it actually had been observed by some of the flight crew and the gate agents that he was walking a little funnily, but the passenger had either had a legitimate one or perhaps made this up, said he had a disability. So the flight crew and the gate agents took his word for it, allowed him to board the plane, and then this happened. So that kind of piggybacks on if an airline observes a passenger that is inebriated prior to departure, they really have to think long and hard about removing him from the plane because they have federal regulations backing him. Yes, sir?
Yeah, what is the definition of drunk for a passenger? Is
Well-
it the same as driving DIU, drunk driving in a car, which is listed in probably 1.5 drinks?
There's actually no standard to that effect. There's no actual like 0.08 or 0.1. It's actually up to the subjective reasonable observations of the captain. So he can make the call if he feels, based on his reasonable observations, that the passenger is drunk and isn't able to fly safely. He can prevent him from boarding the plane.
I think the language I would use, I would say impaired. So it doesn't really matter if he's 0.08 or if it's a drug issue or what have you. If someone's impaired, they're impaired. And I think usually you can tell that just as a layperson, right? If you were around the hotel lobby last night, you would have seen some impairment.
But in this day and age, the airline, and justifiably so, if he didn't indeed have a legitimate disability, can you imagine what the ramifications would have been if they prevented him from boarding the plane when the passenger had a disability? That you're just asking for a lawsuit in that circumstance. So it's a really difficult spot for the airline. But to the best that they can, they really have to prevent these passengers from boarding prior to departure, because once they're on their plane, it's the airline's passenger, and there's nothing else they can do about it.
Well, but you're also making that poor captain have to take on the role of police officer, traffic cop, DUI. Instead, just make a better jetway connector for the small regional. Instead of that crappy little piece of metal. And I sound like a planes attorney, which I'm not, but I can see that side of it.
That's one point. Well, it wasn't the adapter that he fell on. He traversed the adapter, he got to the jet bridge and stumbled in the jet bridge, and he stumbled backwards through the gap.
Did he stumble because of coming off that adapter, though?
We don't know. We haven't gotten that far, but you do a legitimate point. Unfortunately, there's so many different aircraft, there's so many different jet bridges. To come up with a solution that's universal to fit everything, it's a little difficult. That's true too.
I don't know about you, Mike and everybody else, but I mean, I have a ton of jet bridge cases. I probably see as many jet bridge cases as anything in terms of just volume. And as
Should
a
stop making them out of ice. I think that's a bad idea.
It seems that way.
yeah, and you know, a practical consideration. The problem with the jet bridge is everybody wants to inspect a jet bridge. Well, you know, again, it's going to be difficult to completely remove a jet bridge at a major airport out of service for 3 or 4 hours so you can inspect it. So it's always wise to alert opposing counsel that if you do want to have this jet bridge inspection, we're going to have to do it in the middle of the night when it's not being used. And for the most part, I haven't encountered any problems with doing it at night. Everybody seems to realize that you can't take the jet bridge out of service for an extended period of time to allow you to have these inspections.
And that's with just about anything at the airport, right?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
anytime you want to, I know we've had to close down roads and stuff, and it's always the middle of the night. And-
Yeah.
and often in February in Chicago too, so yeah,
Right.
that's how it goes.
And I'll make an RTI plug here. We used RTI to help us out on a jet bridge case. The jet bridge was being decommissioned, so we had a limited window in which to inspect it, and we needed to preserve some evidence of it for the possibility of trial. So we used RTI to do a 3D imagery of the jet bridge when it was docked to the same make and model aircraft, so that we had this amazing 3D rotatable model with all the dimensions and angles, et cetera, preserved. And it was an unusual situation, but and it was expensive, but rightfully so. But the irony of it is that was 2 years ago. That jet bridge is still in service. It was bad information. So the RTI got a good one, but we didn't need it.
Did you get that in evidence, or did you even get that
We
far?
did, we had never got to that point. It was, we did it with the plaintiff's counsel present. Plaintiff's counsel was not an experienced aviation lawyer. They never even asked us to produce it, and, I think at the end of the day, we probably would have, might have been required to, but our position would have been opening, initially, that was our work product, and prepared for litigation, and they had every ability, they had the same time, the same access, they were there the whole time, and didn't avail themselves of the technology.
Knowing
Well,
that
at
it
least
was,
we would have made them split the cost. If they were gonna make us turn that
Right.
over to them, we would have made an application that first it's work product, and second, if forced to, they should bear half the cost because they had equal opportunity to do the same thing.
Mike,
Yes.
3D scans come into evidence all the time. It's very, very typical. So if you're in the type of practice where you do property claims, it's run of the mill. So even if it's not usual for aviation claims, the courts are very experienced with it.
Got it.
And I'll add just, there are a lot of standards on jet bridges, on appropriate slope, side slope, all this other stuff that we learned about in the course of that case. It's ultimately settled during jury selection.
Yeah, that's what those cases seem to do, is they all, trip and fall on the gutters and the side, they're all the same.
or the
right?
wheelchairs.
I get a lot of
really
wheelchair jet bridge
Yeah.
claims, yeah.
Give a ton of
And those vendors always have plenty of coverage, right?
it. Actually, 50-50, I would
Okay.
say. We've got,
Especially the ones in foreign countries.
yeah, that's a whole different story.
If your job is throwing old ladies out of wheelchairs, which I think their job description is, I don't know if they can get covered for that or not, but I see those all the time too.
We have a question.
Oops.
Do any of you know to what extent do air carriers provide training to the flight crew to detect impairment in passengers?
That's a good
That's a
question.
good
I
question.
don't know the answer to that.
As ex-BA flight crew and worked in the safety department for most of the 38 years I worked for BA, pretty well none. And that's the difficulty really, because if a drunk passenger gets on board, they get past the check-in staff, and as long as they're not absolutely dopey, they normally get to the front of the aeroplane where there's most of the time young ladies there who don't recognise it. Maybe they get down, they sit down in the seat, and they then get out a bottle of vodka they bought in a duty-free shop. It's not always the case that the cabin crew are doing. It's very, very difficult, particularly for younger cabin crew.
Yeah.
And there's lots of young ones flying around the UK, particularly on British Airways. And I really sympathise with them to actually spot someone invariably going up to the captain, and have they got that confidence to go up to the captain to say, then you've got a two-pilot operation, you've got typically a pilot leaving it. And there was a case with an airline in the UK, and I flew with a guy, he worked for Dan Air and then came to British Airways, lovely chap, and he said he was caught down the back of the aeroplane, walked down, and the guy knocked him out. So now you're stuck with one pilot flying an aeroplane, so you've got to be very, very careful on how you do this. Training, I don't know, you can walk down the street on a Friday night in most towns, you'll probably get a good idea of what drunk is, but it's very, very difficult for the cabin crew and for the airline.
My guess is there's probably not much.
Hi, I'm a retired captain and retired PSG investigator, and my wife still flies as a flight attendant. And we talk about this whole subject all the time. And I think my answer to your question about so-called training is that airlines will put materials in their training materials and in their policies and procedures that say, you know, you can't board from passenger. And there would be a tremendous amount of training on passenger accommodation and treating them well in order to encourage them to come back and be good customers. But it generally falls to the discretion of the crew about what we're really going to do with somebody who's belligerent or acting out. And oftentimes at many airlines, flight attendants who are, shall we say, experienced and willing to assert themselves don't necessarily get good support from their own management. It's a sort of a wink, wink, nod, nod thing too often. So it comes back to the individual flight attendant or the individual pilot, and sometimes through support of their union to address this sort of thing. So if you're looking for remedies, I think making airlines do a much better job of addressing this problem might be a suitable remedy, which led me to another question, which in your experience here, are claims by passengers against airlines and lawsuits, are they going up, and if so, why?
The value or the amount?
Pardon
The
me?
value or the amount of claims?
I mean the number.
I think they're certainly going up.
I think pardon this, the BS claims are going up. I think
Yeah.
the delay claims, I think the lost baggage claims, I think the nonsense discrimination claims, I think we're seeing a lot of those. And that, they're not valuable claims. Obviously, the accidents are way down, but the sort of nonsense is way
Yeah,
up.
I would say the legitimate claims are fairly steady.
Yeah.
It's the stupid, they think that they've won the lottery, as I like to say, and they're making some ridiculous claim that at the end of the day, they're never going to be able to prove. But it takes time and money to deal with it,
And it's been my observation, and certainly my wife's observation, that the general level of behavior on airplanes is worse now than it used to be. And there seemed to be less self-restraint, and certainly a lot more frivolous claims, a lot more people acting out and misbehaving today on airplanes than there used to be. It seems like the rights of the many, the other people who just want to sit there and get to their destination, are subordinated to the rights of one or two people who, for whatever reason, want to be center of attention.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem that I'd like to see somebody address.
And I think one of the things we've been talking about in the office, I don't know if you guys have, is, obviously you get the initial media attention of someone making a claim and saying, the crew accosted me, whatever, I wasn't drunk, I wasn't belligerent. But what you don't see, and what we don't think a lot is happening, is that those people, when it's proven that they were the wrongdoer, they're not getting prosecuted. Or if they are, that's not making the media, so everyone thinks they can get away with it. So it perpetuates the bad behavior.
That's a good point.
That's right.
And I think it's important to bear in mind for the airline, federal law gives the flight crew and the captain a lot of leeway in deciding who can be on this airplane. And so, as long as a decision is made in good faith, if the pilot in command says, this guy's out of here, and maybe he wasn't drunk, maybe, for whatever reason, the pilot was mistaken, I think he gets out of that lawsuit, though. I think, they have a lot of discretion in who's going to fly on that airplane. And I would like to see them err on the side of kicking people off rather than the alternative. But then, of course, you get the issues with And this is a lot of these plaintiffs are million milers, and they make, they tell everyone at the airline that. And so they try to intimidate the cabin crew into letting them get away with being a big jerk. And so you see that too. So I get there's a lot of sort of issues intermingled here, but.
It's a tough spot for airlines to be in because they're a business and they want to appease their customers and they want their customers to come back. So kicking your customers off planes, removing your customers from planes, it's not good business. But at the same time, they have to think about the safety of the passengers and what have you. So it's a very difficult balance for airlines, to kind of make those decisions. So and I'm sure the airlines pressure the flight crew a little bit to maybe look the other way a little bit for some of these borderline cases because they want to have good business practices and have return customers. So it's a difficult line to kind of balance.
Okay, I was in response to David's question as a corollary to Roger's answer. My husband just finished captain training.
Can you speak up, Stephanie? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I tried to speak louder. I speak softly. As a corollary to Roger's response to David's question, my husband just finished captain training at Republic, and he went through a whole week of basically captain decision-making training, and that included what do you do if there's a drunk passenger on the plane? How do you handle that? And we walked him through scenarios. And I mean, I was there. It's not the first-person experience, but it sounds like they gave them a lot of tools for how to handle that type of situation and when it's appropriate to kick someone off. And Republic's the airline that the Dr. Dowd was on, so they're very conscious of social media issues, and they kind of train that in. So I don't know if that's different from if that has evolved either since you were trained.
Well, Republic had a pretty serious incident last year with serving on a United flight that may have impacted the training that we do.
I certainly hope the airlines are catching up and incorporating these things in their training of the captains, the officers, and the complete flight crew for sure.
Yeah, right.
Just your point about they should kick them off, they should have less tolerance, and that they have a tremendous amount of discretion is 100% true. And then a whole different series of laws kicks into place once they're no longer in the control of the airline. So that's where you can find yourself exposed to defamation, wrongful prosecution, and other claims. And that's why the PR issue is not just a PR issue, but it's a legal one. I had a case in which a passenger sued for defamation after he was removed from an airplane, and he went into the social media, made it sound like he was kicked off the plane for asking for water for his pregnant wife, neglected to mention in the social media that his son kicked the flight attendant in the groin before he was kicked off the plane. Once you're off the plane and you get into, it's very foolish for an airline to get into a media war with a passenger. I think that's a mistake from day one.
You're not going to win.
Once you say something like he was removed from the airplane for violating federal law, you've arguably got a negligence per se claim, or at least one that might survive initial motion practice. So it's just something to be careful about.
Absolutely.
Now I have two questions. One is, you're seeing issues relating to people not having proper visas. I remember years ago that used to be a big deal when the passenger got to the foreign country and wasn't allowed in, maybe was kept like 24 hours before they were allowed to go back, and then sue for false imprisonment. And the second question is, we just saw in the news this week about the sick passengers who all supposedly had flu. I mean, this is not a food poisoning case. What do you think about that? Are you seeing that as a trend, people having illnesses and then suing the airline for somehow not catching that?
You want to take that, Carrie? You want to say
Oh,
that?
well, we haven't actually seen them come in, but there's been a great amount of discussion about air toxicity in the aircraft. And there is a bubbling sort of underground that seems to be starting to make noise about those issues. Not necessarily like someone got on the plane and had the flu and through the air circulation infected the entire plane, but the ideas of the filters having CHFs in them and things like that. And I haven't seen any claims come in quite yet, except for one airline, which I'm not involved in, but I'm aware of it. But I think that's probably gonna be the next, it looks like it might be the next big thing, or at least an attempt to make it one.
As far as the visas, I have seen claims where they're arguing that, you know, the airline made false representations about what they needed as far as the necessary documents. So that's certainly a thing that airlines need to be aware of. Although the contract of carriage says that we're not responsible for those kinds of things, that the passenger is solely responsible for knowing what documentation he needs. We've certainly seen cases where they tried to argue that, oh, I called the airline and the airline told me I only needed this. I showed up at the airport and it turns out I needed that, so I lost my whole vacation. You know, I'm out thousands of dollars. So we certainly try to accommodate if, in fact, you know, the airline misrepresented something, although technically we're probably not liable for that. We would try to accommodate the passenger, but it's a tough thing to prove. You'd have to really show us that there was some kind of misrepresentation, because if not, you know, the contract of carriage is pretty clear that the passengers are solely responsible for knowing what documentation they need as far as passports, visas, if they have an animal, you know, all the requirements for their animal, you know, all the necessary veterinarian documents and those kinds of things. As far as the airborne illness kind of things, I haven't seen a ton of that quite yet. You know, we had the big airline, you know, the Emirates flight, so I'm sure that's coming, although I don't insure them, but.
I'm not familiar with that. What happened on the
It
ambulance
was
flight?
like last week.
Oh, is it? So-
They were, a bunch of them got sick. I think
Okay.
they said they had the flu.
Right, but yeah, the CDC met the airline and they, you know, they had to
They
cordoned off all the
quarantined it off
passengers,
or-
quarantine them all off.
You know,
But,
it's interesting that in a lot of countries now, as you board, there's a camera system that checks, have you been, say, to Africa? I go once a year. Before you board, the camera scans you for temperature and some other items, and they will pull people out of line to make sure they are not contagious with something. I've not seen that in the US. Has anybody seen that in US airports?
No.
I haven't seen that yet, no.
I didn't see it in Rwanda when I was there.
Johannesburg has it,
You should put that in elementary schools.
Daycare.
No one would ever go to the, never any kids in the.
We're almost out of time, but have you seen a lot of support animal claims, or has that kind of died down?
I have a fair amount of support animal claims, but the airlines are getting a lot more strict with the permissible animals, pretty much limited to dogs and cats now, I believe. You know, used to have anything and everything from birds and
Like turkeys,
mini
huh?
ponies, I've heard. But yeah, I think that they're getting really strict with those, and you have to have the proper medical documentation. You have to, you know, they have to. They're very strict. I've had cases where, you know, the passenger shows up at the airport, does have a legitimate emotional needs pet, but they don't have the proper documentation, and the airline prevents the animal from boarding, and they file claims and lawsuits. But you know, if you don't have the proper medical documentation, you know, it's on the passenger, and that's all part of the contract of carriage as well.
Any other questions or comments from the peanut gallery?
I just
Yeah.
have one. You guys only see the cases that are filed, so we get like 50 calls a day.
Well, we appreciate it.
And I thought about, you know, we respond, if it's probably less than 50, but we respond to them all. And
have to.
I always joke that I would just say, I love your case, you need to send me a $10,000 retainer. I never hear from them again. They all want to do it on contingency.
So you can imagine the claims that we get, you know, from the insurance company that are non-suit. You know, we get, you know, at least, 10, 12 a day that, you know, are just so frivolous. And as a former defense attorney, it's so frustrating because I look at the liability aspects of all these claims, and 99% of the time I wouldn't pay a dime if I was only looking at the liability aspect. But because we're a business and we want to encourage, you know, customers returning, and we want to have customer satisfaction as part of our job, you know, we have to pay out on a lot of these claims. So it's definitely a balance that, you know, I have to kind of like tamper down my defense attorney, you know, genes, and put my business hat on and pay some of these out.
Okay, that's right on time. Thanks very much, guys. I thought that was a very thought-provoking